Hello, today we're going to be painting irises, and they do blow easily in the wind. If you can't find a very sheltered spot, the answer is to take a photograph on your telephone. I've placed cotton on the photograph and on the paper so that I can map out the picture. Before I start, I've made some test colours so that I can match the tones, and I will put a list of these colours in the description. I always start with the drawing, but I usually rub it back with a putty rubber before I start so it's not so dominant. I'm starting with the stem. I'm just adding some water to the paint just to move it around a little bit on the page. I will tint and highlight the stem later on in the painting, but until I get the darker petals in, I can't be sure of the exact tone. I'll put the little wrappers on, which I did with grey and Naples yellow. Where the spathe and the buds join, it's like tissue paper. So I'll repeat the grey paint on each of the buds. Next, I'm moving on to the petals, and I'm mixing Cobalt Violet warmed up with a little Alizarin Crimson to just put in the shape of the petal. I've got another petal that's a slightly different colour, but I'm going to put it on with the same pigment to start with, just to give it a base coat. And then continue to the next flower. I'm using clear water to move the paint back a little bit because I want a lost edge, because I've got to add yellow next. The bottom petals have got very light marks which are not white but nearly white, so I'm putting faint yellow on to just cover the white paper. I'll follow the process through to the top flower. I'm going to feather the edge of the yellow paint, making it weaker on the edge because I want it to be a soft transition to the much darker petals. For the dark petals, I'm mixing Prussian blue and Alizarin Crimson together. To make sure I'm happy with the colour, I'm starting with one of the buds before moving on to a flower head. The important part is the shape here, and it goes up to a point, so start with the point and then work the paint back to where the bud's still wrapped around it. As the bud's still tightly furled, it will actually have sideways marks rather than vertical ones, so next thing is to put in some sideways stroke. I'm now going to drop the same colour paint on top of the wet area and with sideways strokes, and it will also help make it look round. And I'll repeat this with the next couple of buds. And I'll continue with the sideways strokes, and the very first bud I put down's now dried off a little bit, and I'm going to make it darker on the right hand side. So I'm just going to follow the shape of the petal to start with, working my way around as evenly as possible. I'm just changing the colour slightly, putting a little bit more crimson in. The petal is a curved surface, and by changing the colour as I go, it will help show this. I'm continuing the brush strokes in the same direction back to the beginning of the petal, and then I'm going to stop and add the light coloured marks. The marks aren't even, they do vary from the middle of the petal to the edge. So I'm going to paint, continuing to the back of the petal in a triangular mode, leaving room for the beard, and then getting the brush to skip to leave the marks. Just keep the brush moving and let it jump over certain areas of the paper. The next petal is completely purple underneath, but the top of it has got white marks. So you can see that by letting the brush skip over the page, it's giving the indication of white marks. Returning to the top flower, there's one petal that's catching the sunlight that's a much lighter colour, so I'm going to put that in first with Cobalt Violet, just warmed up with a little bit of Alizarin Crimson. And I'm following the shape of the delicate petal. And it continues behind the stem and nearly touches the bud, and in fact where it is on the right hand side it is slightly darker, so I will go in with a slightly darker second coat. I think the answer is to put just the cobalt violet on the brush, but it is a very transparent pigment, so it's a question of getting the right amount. So working it down. This next dark petal has got several curves on it and a wiggle on the side, so I'm going to change the direction of my brush strokes and the colour of the paint slightly to make sure that I've captured this. Now, without recharging the brush, I'm just jumping it backwards and forwards to indicate the markings on the petals. I'm now going to the front of the petal again and putting a few extra dark marks on just to show the shape and form of it. And then there's a very dark petal over here, so I'll recharge the paint. And on this occasion I'm starting in the middle. I normally like to try and paint things the way they grow, but as it's dark in the middle, I'm starting there, and then I can vary the shades at either end of the petal. I'm just using slightly lighter paint, Alizarin Crimson, to do the speckled marks, and I'm going to continue with that at the point of the petal as well, and then return to the middle with some Prussian blue to make it darker and show that it's very curved. Small changes in the colour of paint and the tone can make a huge difference to a picture. It just balances it somehow. So I've cleaned the brush off and I'm going back to the green bud now. This bud has got a few purple veins on it where it's just about to break out, so I'll put the Viridian mix with Naples yellow on, and then when it's dry I'll go back and put the very thin purple veins on. I'm just working very gently because it's very subtle and the white paper has to balance with it. So it's going to need a couple of coats, so I'll leave it as it is at the moment. A little bit of green round here. And it's got some of the, what I called onion skin that had already dried out on it. Put that on. Then I'm going to hesitate for a minute because right where it joins there's some purple, so I don't want to spoil it. I'll put that on in a minute. Before I start painting the top petals, I'm referring to the telephone picture again and the colour chart, and I'm going to mix Alizarin Crimson and Cobalt Violet together. Colour match. I'm just trying ordinary Cobalt Violet, and I think as it's very light at the top it needs just the Cobalt Violet. Start at the very top of the flower and work round. I'm using a number 4 synthetic brush. I'm not putting any more paint on, I'm just taking the paint I've already got and moving it. Now pulling it down because that's the way the petal grows, and there are a few marks and lines on it that give it that shape. I'm now going back again because there is a central almost stem to the petal, so I'll pop that in. Now working my way back up again, there's some shadow coming through it from the other side. It doesn't have to be solid paint because the sun's coming through it and it's almost like tissue paper, it's so thin that it doesn't want to be solid. I'm going to add, going over this side this time to mix, I've got the Alizarin Crimson and the Cobalt Violet next to each other, and I think what I'm going to do is add a little bit of French ultramarine. It's almost a shadow here, the darker part of the petal. And then there's a darker area below as well, which I can pop in. It is the reflection of another part of the flower. Sometimes when you're going around you find things that you didn't notice the first time. And then there's a little bit more orangey around this side. Now I can put some more violet and Alizarin Crimson mix on the middle of the flower because it's more vibrant in the middle. The colours are affected by the very dark petals. I've just gone over the petals again, finding any distinctive marks that I can, and I'm now at the stage where I will add the yellow beards. So the yellow beards are quite three-dimensional. They're a bit like caterpillars. So I'm starting with a very weak lemon yellow just to cover the white paint, and then I'm going to go in with much bolder colours to make it look three-dimensional. I'm changing to chrome yellow and just putting on a few key points, and then I'll add the three-dimensional yellow beards. The parts of the petal that are in shade, I'm using yellow ochre to make it look more subdued. I've put the base colour of yellow down, and I'm going to just mix some cadmium orange and cadmium yellow together to give a vibrant highlight. I wanted to judge one colour against another. I'm now adding weaker yellow just to feather the beard out and make it stand up. Now I'm going to go back with a clear brush in a minute and push it back so that it's got a slightly light curved edge. Now I'm returning to yellow ochre for the underneath because it's the bit that's not in direct sunlight. And then with the water just on the brush, no paint at all, just pushing the bright yellow back to make it look three-dimensional. Now moving back to the top green bud, which I'm mixing Naples yellow and Viridian. It has to be seamless where it meets the bud. So you've got to have one solid line. You can't have a jump or a step around. There is some purple showing through, so I only want to go so far. Then I've got to add the grey colour. The next one has actually got a lot of purple showing through, so I'm going to put that in next and then go back to the parchment-like top. I deliberately haven't cleaned my palette from earlier, so I've got the same mix of colour, and I'm just going along and just putting a tiny hint of the petal trying to break out of the bud. There's no rule for doing it, it's just a question of indicating it that it's there. And then I'll move on to the parchment-like layer that did sort of hold the bud in place before it broke out that far. As it's now dried almost to a clear crisp, I'm using Naples yellow and Davy's grey to just give a hint of the dried foliage. And to make it look slightly more natural, I'm going to go over the purple pieces that are showing through with clear water just to merge them slightly. I'm just going back on the two buds just to make sure the lines match exactly to give the look of a bud. The bud needed a perfect edge, but the petal needs a lost and found edge, so I'm just going to give it a tickle with a flat brush and just lose a little bit of paint. Get the tones a little bit delicate. Because they're moving all the time in the breeze, or the sunlight is changing by the minute, that all these things are very fleeting. So I'm just dabbing it with the brush, wiping the brush off on some tissue. Just get a lost and found edge. The idea with watercolour is the water does the work. Now this petal here hasn't really got a stalk, it's got a middle line as how it's formed, and that's quite light. But then there's dark shadows going up beside it. So I'll just mix all my earlier purples together and gently put in a line. And I'll leave that for a moment. I can see while I'm doing that there's a little bit of extra shadow here, and we can still see through to the other side of the flower. So that needs to be done very delicately. Now there's three colours in here. I've got light purple, I've got yellow, and I've almost got crimson. So I'll start with what looks like crimson. So I'm using Alizarin Crimson and I'm warming it up with some yellow ochre. I'm trying to keep the colours fairly simple. I'll just add a bit of purple to it just to knock it back a little bit. And I've got to put in a tiniest brush stroke behind the yellow beard, and that will also bring the yellow beard forward. Just going in very gently. And then that is matched to similar colours on the left and the right. So now I will go to Cobalt Violet, hardly any on the brush, and do up and down strokes to indicate the shape of the petal that's the other side of the flower. I'll have to let that dry before I can highlight it, but it's still separating this petal and that petal from the other side. So the yellow beard can have a little bit more. Now I put the dark colour in, it can actually be brought forward a little bit more with a bit more punch. So I've got chrome yellow with a little bit of orange on it. And I'll do what I did before, which is get a clean brush and just knock some back so it's got sort of a wet edge to come back to. And then there's a couple of little triangles here which I can put in, barely visible, but they do make a difference. I'll dry the brush off. I want them to be soft, I don't want them to be hard. Just to harmonise that petal. And it's now looking far more hollow. And then I've got something that's very, very dark, so I'm going to add some Payne's grey to the earlier mix of Prussian blue and Alizarin Crimson, and put in a very, very dark line. And there's also a very, very dark one on the edge. I'm just adding a little bit of detail to the inside of the flower, but I want it to look hollow, so I'm not going to put too much detail in. I tickled the petals a little bit, found a few highlights here and there, but you have to know when to stop. I've also just put a tiny bit more paint on the dark petals. I've given them a cover of Alizarin Crimson just to blend everything together.